The searing heat of the tropical sun has shaped the face of warfare in the Middle East and Africa for thousands of years. Some generals have adapted and prospered, others have failed to come to grips with this unforgiving opponent. One man who is to succeed brilliantly is one of the most famous generals to step onto the stage of history. His name, Alexander the Great. Over 300 years before the birth of Christ, this 22-year-old man embarked on a meteoric campaign of conquest. By its triumphant end, he was undisputed master of an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Indus. To his countrymen, he was the embodiment of glory, a heroic warrior in the classical mold. To his soldiers, an inspiring leader who shared the bitter hardships of constant campaigning with unflagging energy. Alexander was probably one of the greatest generals of ancient times, if not the greatest general. He managed to combine extreme youth with some of the greatest feats that a general of any age could ever hope to achieve. And he achieved most of his victories in some of the most uncompromising climates, under the heat of a baking desert sun.
The marches and conquests of Alexander the Great are some of the most remarkable in the whole history of military enterprises, from Greece to Egypt, into the Near and Middle East, and as far as India. They're really stupendous, and even by 20th century standards, one has got to stand back in admiration of them.
If you look at Alexander the Great, and you can come forward 1,000 years, and the people in between times have actually to move through exactly the same passes. They've got to go down through exactly the same rivers, across the same fords, through the same cities, because of such things as pasture lands, fresh meat, water. You have to be able to move your supplies with you across vast areas. And it doesn't make any difference whether it's Alexander the Great or whether 1,000 years later it's the Eastern Roman Empire. You still have the same basic problems.
His officers were eager to march in a crusade to liberate Asian Greeks and avenge the humiliation of Athens. But none of them could have guessed how far their king would take them in the pursuit of his glory. He would lead them past the edge of the known world. To North Africa, through great deserts and on to Egypt, the mystical home of the pharaohs. It's a sobering thought, but the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient when Alexander stood and pondered in their shadow. But such conspicuous personal leadership had its own price. In the course of his career, Alexander was badly wounded 9 times, and on several occasions, his life was only saved by the swift actions of his friends. On campaign, Alexander took a staff of writers, historians, and poets with him. His efforts certainly worked. The stories of his youth and his campaigns kept his memory alive. He may have been an astute self-publicist, but Alexander was first and foremost a soldier. He lived for conquest, and it was this insatiable thirst that drove him and his army ever onwards. The death of his mortal enemy, King Darius, elevated Alexander to the throne of the Persian Empire, as well as a unified Greece. He was master of all he surveyed, but Alexander still wasn't satisfied. It was now that he began to talk of his greatest ambition, and when men heard it, they thought he had gone mad. Alexander planned to conquer India with an army of his own creation. The atmosphere among his veterans became more and more strained. There were sporadic mutinies, but Alexander held them together by the force of his charismatic personality. and the great adventure got underway.
The real difficulty there was not logistics, it was not numbers, it was a question of motivation on the part of his troops. They did not want to go on at that particular stage, and that was the point. There were various campaigns, various stages they did take en route, but the fact was they'd been away for so long and they wanted home, and that was the basic problem that Alexander had to face, and he could not overcome it.
The Indian campaign was the hardest of all Alexander's military ventures. The climate and landscape was savage. Untraveled jungles, rivers half a mile wide, burning deserts, freezing mountains. The resistance he met was more determined and fierce. In pitched battles, Alexander's phalanxes faced a new and nightmarish enemy, the Indian war elephant. The relentless rays of the sun could not defeat him, but in Alexander's case, the very elements seemed to be conspiring against him. Even a sudden switch from remorseless heat to a titanic rainstorm couldn't defeat the master of the elements. Plutarch's account of the Battle of Halun dwells on the difficulties Alexander faced. He was overwhelmed by a great rainstorm with terrible thunderbursts and lightning flashes. Despite a number of his men being struck down by lightning, he continued to advance. The ground had become broken and slippery, impossible for his men to hold their footing on. But Alexander rode on, ahead of his cavalry. Remembering the threat of the elephants and their greater numbers, Alexander attacked their left. The Indian army was routed and fell back upon their own elephants. The Indians rallied, and stubborn fight started. After 8 long hours, the enemy was broken. The experience of battle and the atrocious conditions finally broke the spirit of Alexander's men more surely than any defeat. After thousands of miles trudging over sun-baked landscapes, they had reached the end of their endurance. Confronted with their silent ranks, Alexander could not even move them with threats, promises, or bribes. The time had come to go home. Summoning his fleet, Alexander embarked his troops and sailed for the mouth of the Indus. It was almost as if his personal high water mark had been reached. He turned for home, his dream unfulfilled. Alexander's conquering armies were to be followed by other Europeans who battled with varying degrees of success against the heat and dust of the Middle East. In 1096, a steel tide of knights, men-at-arms and pilgrims traveled from Western Europe to the burning sands of Palestine. They carried before them the cross of Christ, and they marched to liberate Jerusalem, the most sacred city of the medieval world, from the hated infidel. History remembers these 7 savage wars as the Crusades.
Fighting in the Crusades was very controlled by seasonal factors. From the early part of summer, when there was forage available, through into the autumn would be the campaigning season. When winter came, the crusading armies would go into quarters in their castles or fortified towns. But with the Muslim troops, there was in fact a dissolution of the armies when winter came. The soldiers simply wanted to go back home, and would go back home no matter what sort of disciplinary procedures were put upon them. As a result, there was a certain attitude amongst the Crusaders that if we can get past the autumn, if we can survive past the autumn, then there is no problem until the following year. And this assisted their basic strategy, which was very often, indeed usually, to avoid pitched battle wherever possible. A pitched battle risked the existence of a kingdom. They would fight sieges and they would fight smaller engagements, but on the whole, one tried to avoid pitched battle unless you were fighting at a great advantage.
The first Crusaders, under the command of Godfrey of Bouillon, finally arrived outside Jerusalem in June 1099. With the great prize suddenly before them, the 25,000 Christian soldiers could not contain themselves. They hurled themselves at the city walls, but the determined Muslim defenders beat off their attacks. The Crusaders finally took control of the city walls of Jerusalem and swarmed into the city on July the 15th. The Christian soldiers embarked on a crazed orgy of violence that resulted in the ritual slaughter of some 40,000 of Jerusalem's Muslim inhabitants. No one was safe from the merciless killing. Men, women, and children were summarily put to the sword. Mosques and holy places were defiled and desecrated. The Jewish synagogue was razed to the ground, and those who had sought shelter from the bloodlust of the Crusaders within its walls were burned alive. The capture of Jerusalem was not a permanent event, and soon the city was back in Muslim hands. A second crusade followed this time, without success. Nearly 100 years after the first successful crusade, a third great army of Christ set out to reclaim the Holy City. Once again, they hoped to emulate the bloody success of the first crusade. The central characters of the Third Crusade were two of the most glamorous of the age. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was the charismatic leader of the Muslim forces. The dominant personality of the Crusader armies was Richard the Lionheart of England. Pope Gregory VIII proclaimed the Third Crusade amid much optimism. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had come as a shock to all Christians, and now the three great rulers of Western Christendom were to be joined together in a holy alliance to reclaim the sacred city. Joining Richard were Philip II of France and the German king and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa. The largest crusading army ever to leave Europe was about to make the worst possible start. Frederick Barbarossa was nearly 70 years old when he took the cross, but seized by the Crusaders' zeal, he set out for the Holy Land on June the 10th, 1189. His army was so large that there were not enough ships to carry it. So he traveled overland, across the Dardanelles and into Asia, along a route not used since the First Crusade more than 100 years earlier. Although the army was successful as it fought its way through the Byzantine Empire, it fell prey to the old non-military enemies of hunger and thirst. Many men died and many more deserted, but in July 1190, it suffered another blow when the aged Barbarossa died crossing a river. Richard the Lionheart's army set out from Acre on August the 22nd, 1191, headed for the strategically important town of Jaffa, the place Richard believed was the best situated for the attack on Jerusalem. Soon the Crusaders and the Saracens would meet for the first time in open battle, and for the first time, the two sides' very different fighting tactics would be put to the test.
Climate affected the nature of fighting, and this is because of the centrality, the central position of the horse for both armies. For the Crusaders, their prime tactic, their battle-winning tactic, was the charge by heavily armoured knights on horseback. This was the manoeuvre which they had to use with care because it was a one-shot operation, but it tended to win battles. But it did mean the horse was a prime factor. Similarly, for the Muslim forces, the mounted archer was their prime weapon. More mobile, because lighter than the crusading armies, but nevertheless central to them. So the horse is central to both armies.
The one thing that is very noticeable is that the Crusaders, to survive, had to go for an all-arms battle group. It sounds silly, but they are basically having to adopt a very much a 20th century formation for marching and for fighting, of cavalry, of infantry, of archers, all together for mutual support. If you sent out one force of infantry, it would be destroyed. If you sent out a cavalry by itself, it would be destroyed. In those conditions, you had to send out a force, mixed force, that could provide for its own defence. And it had to have archers, the infantry, and the cavalry together.
The battle tactics of the Saracen forces were based upon speed and mobility. Recognizing that the Crusaders' greatest strength lay in the use of their formidable cavalry in conjunction with the infantry, the aim of the lightweight Saracen horsemen was to isolate the two by drawing the cavalry away from the main army. When this was done, the plan was to further isolate smaller groups of cavalry and to defeat each in detail. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, ingenious use had been made of hit-and-run tactics, which had involved the lighter Saracen cavalry feigning withdrawal, luring the Crusader cavalry away from their positions before turning on them when they were beyond help from the infantry. The Saracen horsemen had then been free to return to the static Crusader infantry and launch attacks on them.
A battle which you can say was very directly affected by climate was the Battle of Hattin, which was a defeat in 1187 for the Crusaders. Briefly, Muslim forces had laid siege to the city of Tiberias, and the Crusaders decided to send a relief party. It was a matter of some 15 to 20 miles that they had to go, but the Muslim forces so discommoded their line of march by repeated attacks, and so affected them by lighting fires along the way so that the smoke blew into them and affected them, that the Crusaders decided they had to stop and pitch camp halfway along. The trouble was there was no place where they could find water to pitch camp. And so in the late afternoon and early evening and right through the night, they were waterless. Then they had to get up the next day and struggle on. And of course, the Muslim forces were waiting for them. And that was a battle, the result of which you could almost say was foreordained, because the Christian forces went into it tormented by thirst, with the horses in a very wilting condition, and they lost the battle very badly indeed.
Finally, with Jaffa coming ever nearer and the threat to Jerusalem growing by the day, Saladin was forced into making an all-out attack on Richard's army at Arsuf, 15 miles north of Jaffa, on September the 7th, 1191. In a letter to the abbot of Clairvaux, Richard recalled that the army finally reached Jaffa on September the 29th, 1191, and fortified the city with ditches and a wall with the intention of protecting the interests of Christianity to the best of his ability. Constant fighting and the morale-sapping effects of the heat had taken its toll on the king and his army. Practical considerations had, to some extent, supplanted religious zeal. To continue inland to Jerusalem would mean a march away from the army's much-needed supply ships. Richard concluded that if ever there was a time to talk, it was now, and he opened negotiations with Saladin. Richard knew the military position only too well, and the question was a simple one. If he were to capture Jerusalem, how would it be held after his return home? It had become clear that while the surviving Christian knights were as keen as ever to wrest the holy city from the infidel, fewer relished the thought of living there for the rest of their lives. There was nothing to be done. An organized retreat was the only option. The news was broken to the disappointed and disheartened troops, and the army headed back to the ruined city of Ascalon in January 1192. And so, the Great Holy Crusade was about to end in terrible anticlimax. The crusading army that had sacked Cyprus, besieged Acre, and been victorious at Arsuf had been told to turn on its heels within sight of the final prize. Richard, perhaps against his better judgment, was persuaded to make another final attempt to take Jerusalem. On June the 11th, the Crusader army arrived back at Beit Nuba, only to be confronted, of course, with the very same problems that had forced their withdrawal 6 months earlier. Despite bitter arguments, they were forced once again to turn back, this time to Acre. There was, however, to be a final twist in the tale. For on July the 27th, only one day after Richard's arrival, Saladin's forces appeared at the gates of Jaffa. This was to be Richard the Lionheart's last great battle. The Third Crusade had at last run its course. Both sides were completely exhausted, and King Richard himself had fallen dangerously ill. Finally, after nearly 3 years on campaign, Richard the Lionheart set sail from the Holy Land on October the 9th, never to return. It was not only Richard the Lionheart who failed to achieve victory under the desert sun. Fighting in the unfamiliar conditions of the Egyptian desert, even the armies of Napoleon were to come unstuck, overcome as much by the effects of heat, dust, and disease as by the actions of his enemies.
The problem is not actually one of initial conquest or even movement into Palestine and along the coast through the Sinai. That is done very reasonably, very well. The problem is actually the logistic support from France. That was a difficulty. And once that line was cut, then it was a defeat waiting to happen. An army operating in that theatre has to have close naval support. The second it comes up against an enemy fort, especially if the enemy has a fleet, then he's finished. Because the whole of his flanks, the whole of his rear area is totally exposed. To move in the desert, you have to have the support of your naval forces. Right there. To guard your flank, to carry the war into the enemy rear areas.
These are the remains of the Mareth line in Tunisia. It was here that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel fought his last battle in Africa. Like Richard and Napoleon before him, he was to be defeated to a large extent by the elements in the unforgiving desert theatre. As a powerful British force closed inexorably on the last remnants of the Afrika Korps, the Desert Fox issued his final battle orders from this very position. It was the end of a proud force that has become a legend in warfare, the Afrika Korps. In 1940, the German Wehrmacht was singularly ill-equipped for battle beneath the relentless sun of North Africa. German military formations were created for European conditions. They did not possess even one unit specifically trained for fighting in desert conditions.
They were totally unprepared. The Italians were unprepared for the war that was to come for other reasons. They simply didn't have the heavy tanks, they did not have the infrastructure, and of course the great problem that they had in Libya was the fact they didn't have a forward rail system. Now the Germans, when they arrived, literally were under strength critically in terms of logistic tails. They needed hundreds, literally hundreds more vehicles to be able to have the mobility that they needed.
What you did find, however, was simply that the general standard of German design, of tanks especially, but of trucks, anti-tank weapons and so forth, was so good that it could be pitched into an environment like that and found to work. Plainly, the general parameters for the tanks, the size of the tracks, the endurance and maintenance requirements and so forth, were aimed at very much a European campaign. However, the quality of design, as I said, of the Mark III and Mark IV tank was so good that it could encounter this kind of alien environment and work very well indeed.
By contrast to the Germans, the British had years of desert experience, dating back to before the First World War. The British have been active in North Africa since the days of Napoleon and maintained a permanent presence in Egypt. During the early years of World War II, the British enjoyed a steady stream of success against the Italian forces in North Africa. Desperate to keep his Axis partner in the war, in January 1941, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 22, codenamed Operation Sonnenblume, or Sunflower. It authorized the transport of a small German force to Tripoli to assist the Italians in blocking further British advances. The desert in North Africa has been described as a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. For a progressive thinker like Rommel, it was a paradise because of its vast uninhabited emptiness, with no changing seasons, no partisans, no resistance groups, no urban centers to slow the movements of armored divisions. But for the men in charge of logistical support, it was a pure hell, because everything, fuel, ammunition, food, weapons, had to pass along tortuously extended lines of supply, which had become ever more stretched as the Afrika Korps stormed eastwards.
The first problem is the huge amount of supplies needed because the environment supplies nothing. The second problem is, of course, the environment is very, very harsh. The consumption of fuel and oil doubles because of the conditions that you're fighting under. Similarly, water for radiators, water for men. There's a great increase here. So the desert is extraordinarily difficult for the quartermaster, though a person like Rommel, who was a born tactician, it's in fact a paradise.
Together, the German and Italian forces in North Africa needed at least 70,000 tons of supplies every month. All of it had to come by sea, from ports in southern Italy, and all of it came under attack by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Minor amounts of supplies were flown in from time to time, but the unarmed Junkers 52 transport aircraft were rarely available in sufficient numbers, and, in any case, it presented itself as a sitting duck for any marauding hurricanes. Although the logistical difficulties faced by the Afrika Korps were enormous, there is no question they were short of supplies. They were never adequately provided for. Rommel was eager to advance as far and as quickly as possible. He had his eyes focused on the Suez Canal, his final objective. Despite the fact that it was over 800 miles from his main supply port in Tripoli to the Egyptian frontier, Rommel viewed the question of supply as a matter for the High Command to solve. Water and the lack of it was always a problem, and it was not unknown for supply lorries to make journeys of 500 kilometers to collect supplies of precious water. Once again, thirsty radiators and equally thirsty men consumed a large part of the water they were carrying.
Water supply, plainly, there is effectively no water in the desert. It's got to be brought in, and water weighs quite remarkably heavily in quantity and takes up bulk. There's no way that you can compress it. The standard allowance was around half a gallon, 4 pints per man per day. But this was for everything, for shaving, washing and drinking. The minimum level that people could survive on was around 1 pint a day, and during the siege of Tobruk in 1941, the British troops were down to 1 pint of water per man per day for all purposes, and Rommel noted in his very useful little notebooks that British prisoners captured on this regime were really in rather poor condition. They were not very good at fighting, and they were in fact slowly dying.
With nightfall, there usually came an end to the day's armoured fighting, but not necessarily to armoured movement. Panzer crews were taught to read a compass, enabling them to travel under the cloak of darkness and during the blinding fury of a sandstorm. German recovery crews were also quick to seize the advantage after dark, to recover their damaged tanks and send them back for repair. They would also seize the chance to blow up or commandeer any Allied tanks which had been left abandoned on the battlefield. The drastic problems of resupply for the Afrika Korps made the repair of damaged tanks an overriding necessity if they were to offset their numerical disadvantage against the better supplied Allied forces. In the featureless desert, the art of concealment, camouflage, was another skill quickly learned by the men of the Afrika Korps. The crews quickly learned to make skillful use of netting and the camel thorn bush to break up the outline of their tanks. The field gunners became expert at digging in their weapons. If they couldn't dig them into the sand, they would blast the rocky ground aside to make a gun pit. With the barrels pointing horizontally, there was, as Rommel himself put it, scarcely anything to be seen. For the infantry, camouflage netting served a dual purpose. In their slit trenches, netting hid them from view and also supplied a degree of protection from the heat of the sun. Despite the fact that he personally had to cross large areas of featureless terrain, the restless energy of Rommel drove his men forward. When he was not at the helm of his command gun, Graf, Rommel was to be found reconnoitering the ground from the cockpit of his Fieseler Storch, a reconnaissance aircraft, from which he was constantly urging his troops forward. Behind Rommel's early successes in his advance eastward was his firm belief that he could crush the Allied forces and continue his advance all the way to Alexandria and the Suez Canal. From there, he could set his sights on the Caucasus in the southern Soviet Union and then achieve a classic pincer movement, striking a decisive blow in Germany's war.
There is no circumstances under which the Axis forces could have succeeded in North Africa. To have been successful, there would have had to have been a major German effort that made this the main theatre of operations for a particular time. The problem for the Axis was threefold. You have to get supplies across the Mediterranean. You've got to be able to unload those supplies in North African ports, and then you've got to be able to move the supplies forward to the battle zones. And you have to do all three simultaneously over extended periods. Now, there's times when the Germans and the Italians could do one or two of those things, but very seldom could they ever manage to do all three, and certainly not over an extended period. They would have needed basically twice as many forces with perhaps 3 or 4 times the lift capability to have even begun the major attack. The wonder is that they managed to get as far as they did.
The idea of Rommel linking up with Army Group South in its drive through the Caucasus, and Rommel's drive to Egypt and on to Palestine in 1942, has to be described as a mere flight of fancy. In many respects, it actually shows the very unrealistic nature of German strategic planning during the Second World War. The logistic problems that Rommel faced were immense. Even if he had have taken Cairo, even if he had got into the Delta, he would still have had to fight his way over the Suez Canal. He would then have had to have fought his way through the Medellai Pass and the Gilei Pass, through the Sinai. There was not the slightest possibility of the great strategic link-up ever taking place.
In the summer and autumn of 1942, there were just no spare resources to send to Rommel. The Russian front was eating it all up, whereas the British and the Americans could, for a short while, make that the main focus of their war effort. History doesn't often, I think, turn on a small thing. Occasionally it does. Battle of Midway, Pearl Harbor, there are a few things like that, but even those, when you start thinking in the long run, will simply mean America will take another 2 years to win the war. But win the war they will.
Rommel was forced to retreat in December 1941 after some of the most punishing and bloody battles of the Desert War. Rommel realized that the strength of the Afrika Korps could not hold out for much longer, and given this position, he decided to retreat back to his start line of April 1941 to rebuild his forces and to launch another campaign in 1942. Despite being desperately short of supplies, Rommel began his counteroffensive. The Afrika Korps attacked once more. Eventually, the Allied 8th Army was forced eastwards to the Egyptian frontier. Rommel maintained a hectic pursuit of the British forces as they fell back to prepare positions at El Alamein. And the two battles for El Alamein would decide the destiny of the North African campaign. The new commander of the 8th Army, Montgomery, launched an attack in late October, but only after he had built up a 3-to-1 superiority in almost everything: tanks, guns, aircraft, and men, really forcing Rommel to fight a war of attrition. Under the steady onslaught of the British 8th Army, the Panzer Army was forced to retreat further and further westwards. From October 1942 to February 1943, the Afrika Korps was pushed back from El Alamein, out of Libya, and into Tunisia. Rommel, now a disillusioned and physically sick man, was ordered to leave his beloved Afrika Korps on March the 9th, 1943. He flew back to Europe deep in despair about the approach of the inevitable end. During the first days of May, an incredibly ferocious artillery and air bombardment ripped into the German positions. At the heart of the defense of Tunis, the 15th Panzer Division made a desperate last attempt to survive the overwhelming Allied forces. The guns fired until there was no more ammunition. The tanks, when their petrol was gone, carried on firing from where they stopped until they too ran out of ammunition. In early May, slowly, reluctantly, the white flags of surrender began to appear from the men whom Hitler had ordered to fight to the last. The Allies marched triumphantly into Tunis. 50 years later, on the 24th of February 1991, a new desert war erupted. This time, helicopter assault came of age, as Schwarzkopf's blitzkrieg was unleashed against the Iraqi lines. Their ability to deliver a decisive number of troops and their supporting heavy weapons behind enemy lines was critical to the success of his plans.
There were plainly a number of changes comparing the 1991 Desert Storm with the fighting in North Africa in 1942. They're both in the same kind of environment, obviously, a desert environment. That's perhaps where the similarities come to an end. One thing that is very noticeable with Desert Storm is the much more effective use that is made of air power. Air power is simply devastating at this time. The result is that aircraft in the 5-week campaign, which precedes the ground campaign, probably destroy 30 to 40% of Saddam Hussein's tanks, artillery, and fixed emplacements of all kind. So the use of aircraft is a major change.
The American problem, quite simply, was to get supplies through to Saudi Arabia on a scale that would enable Saudi Arabia to service roughly 500,000 troops. The American program involved basically landing an aircraft every 26 seconds, but they couldn't do it. It took every 39 seconds. So instead of taking 4 months, it took 6 months. And the log jams, strangely, were not the ones you think of. The log jams were basically lack of aprons, lack of petrol bowsers, and lack of forklift trucks to move the things off of aircraft and into storage depots. That was the basic problem. Then it's, of course, getting it forward into the battle zones, and it takes 6 months.
As part of his plan to catch the Iraqi forces off guard, Schwarzkopf went for what he called a Hail Mary play. Instead of sending his forces through the Iraqi defenses, he would go around them. For deception, he used the US Marines to fake the major thrust into the middle of the Iraqi line along the coast, while the 18th and 7th Corps raced left beyond the Saddam line. The two blows were struck simultaneously, with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force breaking through the minefields into Kuwait with a classically executed operation, while the US Navy was shelling the coast as if in preparation for an amphibious landing. Far to the west, where the Iraqis were less alert, one of the great encirclement movements in warfare was launched. Elements of the US 18th Corps, supported by the French Doguet Armored Division, began a wide sweep across the desert into Iraq itself. The aim of this move was to cut Highway 8, which runs from Basra to Baghdad, and so trap the divisions of the Republican Guard, while the French secured the western flank of the advance. In support of this bold maneuver, the largest helicopter assault force ever assembled lifted off at 0740. The following day, the 101st Airborne launched an assault towards the Euphrates River Valley near Nasiriyah. 300 helicopters lifted a brigade of 3,000 troops 130 miles to the north and cut Highway 8. Helicopter supply and resupply was an innovative feature of the whole conflict. In training, helicopter pilots had honed their ability to carry vehicles, weapons, and troops, extracting personnel and assault targets. But no one could have expected the scale on which these skills would now be put into practice. Helicopter transports were a major factor in allowing the ground war to continue at the phenomenal pace of the air war. the M1 Abrams saw its first action in the Gulf and was a truly valuable component of the conflict. One of its few limitations in the wide scope of this theater was the range of the M1. Unlike a family car, the M1 consumes fuel at a rate of gallons per mile. Its need for refueling deep in the desert was fulfilled by establishing fuel dumps in what was enemy territory only hours before. Each tank was refueled as fast as possible, and then back on to the next target, even deeper into Iraqi territory. By the afternoon of Wednesday, February the 27th, 1991, the war was over. Iraqi forces had been smashed on all fronts and driven out of Kuwait. In the wake of defeat, they left enormous fires as oil wells they set alight burned. On the so-called highway to hell from Kuwait City, abandoned, burnt-out vehicles signposted the path of the fleeing army. The scale and scope of Schwarzkopf's victory on the battlefield was enormous. For the Gulf War was the first space-age war. Night vision equipment gave men and machines the option of fighting out of the worst of the heat. It seemed that technology had finally conquered both terrain and the merciless sun.